Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 130, the Jinshin War Part 2, Gathering Stormclouds. The soldier on watch was doing his best to keep alert. The night shift was never pleasant duty, and it was even less pleasant out here in the mountains. There were plenty of sounds in the night, birds and animals out in the darkness, but rarely was there much actual action. At least the sky was clear, with only the occasional cloud. Guarding a post station was hardly the worst duty in the world. There was a decent amount of traffic. After all, they were along one of the major routes between Ise and Yamato. But at night, well, who wanted to try to navigate the mountain roads? It was a great way to fall into a river and drown, or get lost in the woods, unable to find your way back to civilization. So it must have been a shock when he saw a light in the distance. There were almost always a few fires somewhere in the village, but most of them were out or covered at this time of night, with the exception of the odd torch here and there, but this was something more. At first the guard thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, and then he wondered if it was some kind of mountain spirit. He'd heard of ghost parades that would come and take people in the night. He shivered and instinctively checked his own torch to ensure that it was burning well and bright. Indeed, it was. It took him a little time for his eyes to adjust again to the darkness, but now, sure enough, he saw the torches coming, and not just one, many of them. And he could now hear the faint clank of metal on metal. He then heard a faint twang, like a tight rope being suddenly plucked. It only just started to dawn on him what was happening when the first arrows started to rain down on his position. They were under attack. Welcome back. This episode, we are continuing with our coverage of the Jinshin War, the Jinshin War of 672. And if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you start with episode 129, where we talk about some of the background for what was happening. That said, let's do a quick recap to bring us up to speed on where we are, and then we'll dive into an account of an absolutely unbelievable journey, which is impressive for multiple reasons, but mostly for the speed at which it was able to take place. So as you may recall, Nakano Oe, aka Tenji Tenno, passed away at the end of 671 after months of illness. After first becoming bedridden, the Chronicles tell us that he offered the state to his younger brother, the crown prince, Prince Oama. But Oama was warned that it was actually a trap, and as such, he turned down the offer. Instead, he retired from his position to become a monk and left for Yoshino, taking half of his household with him. With Oama retired, Nakano Oe's son, the 23-year-old Prince Otomo, took the throne. After Nakano Oe's death, Otomo effectively ruled Yamato from the Otsu Palace in Omi, running things along with the ministers of the left and right, Soga no Akae and Nakatomi no Kane, and the other high ministers as well. Though the Nihon Shoki does not acknowledge it, Otomo is thought to have been a formal sovereign, indeed if not in name. Much later, he would be given the posthumous name of Kobun Tenno. It would seem that Otomo and the Omi court had misgivings about Prince Oama's promise to retire from the world and not challenge the throne. The Nihon Shoki recounts that they began to make subtle preparations for a conflict. This included levying men, theoretically to build Nakano Oe's tomb, but then issuing them weapons instead of tools. They also set up checkpoints along the road from the court in Otsu all the way down to Asuka, the main route to where Oama was residing in Yoshino. And then finally, someone told Oama that they were no longer allowing Prince Oama's people to cross the Uji Bridge to bring him and his household supplies. Prince Oama was not going to sit idly by while the Omi court gathered up enough forces to claim he was doing something treasonous and then march on him in Yoshino, and so he sent one of his most trusted vassals, Oyori, to the east to seek support. Meanwhile, he himself was making ready to move. There was just one more thing before setting out: seeing if he could get posting bells. Now, this was sparked by the words of one of his advisors, who suggested that they should be careful. They did not have many soldiers in Yoshino, and they had already sent out a general like Oyori to start raising troops in the east. At the same time, if the Omi court was also maneuvering, it was likely that they would have sent word to the various post stations to bar the roads and prevent any movement. As such, Prince Oama decided to send several messengers to ask for posting bells so that Oama and his men could make use of the official horses at various post stations, allowing them to travel much more quickly and freely. Of course, as a royal prince, as the former crown prince, one would think that this would typically not be much of an issue. However, it was not clear if any orders had come from the Omi court, and if they had, where exactly the local government officials in Asuka might place their loyalty. Of particular importance was the case of Prince Takasaka, who was in charge of the Okamoto Palace and thus the governance of the ancient capital, from what we can tell. He would be the one to grant posting bells if they were to receive them. And if he provided the bells, then Oama and his party could assume that they would have little to no trouble making their way east. And so Prince Oama sent his envoys to the Okamoto Palace. The messengers requested posting bells, but Prince Takasaka refused to issue them. This sent a clear message to Prince Oama. The Omi court had no intention of letting him and his household have free access to the roads, and the local officials in Asuka were not going to provide any support. In fact, Prince Takasaka now knew that Oama planned to travel, and if he wanted to, Takasaka could likely raise troops to try to stop Oama from leaving. At the very least, he would no doubt be sending a swift horse to Otsu to inform the Omi court. Oama and his followers would have to hurry if they wanted to do anything. And so, on the 24th of the 6th month, the same day that Oama got word back about the posting bells, he made his decision to move. He and his entourage left quickly. He didn't even let anyone saddle a horse for him or prepare his carriage. He just started to head out on foot on a journey to the east, and keep in mind that most of what I'm going to describe in the rest of this episode happened over the course of about one night, or really about 1.5 days. Truly an epic journey for Oama and all of those with him. Now, the Chronicles list about 20 men and over 10 women who originally set out with Oama from Yoshino, including his wife, the royal princess Uno no Sarara, daughter of Nakano Oe himself. She wasn't walking, however. She followed a little behind in a palanquin or a litter carried on poles. I do wonder if those carrying the palanquin are among those mentioned, or were they servants or even enslaved persons who weren't considered worthy of note, which brings to mind the question of just how many people really were there. Was it just the 30, or was it more? Because it does make a difference when you're traveling with a large group. Now, the path they traveled wound its way through the mountains. Streams and rivers had carved channels and valleys, and people had settled these areas and created paths through the wilderness. Now, the valleys were fairly well populated, with roads connecting the communities that had grown up in the nooks and hollers. These facilitated trade through the mountain communities and between the eastern and western sides of the Kii Peninsula, but even still, it was not exactly easy terrain. Unlike roads in the flat plains, the width of the roads in the mountains would have been constrained by steep mountainsides and the natural twists and turns of the valley. There may have been rope or wooden bridges that they had to cross as streams constantly flowed down the hillsides to the rivers below. This route would make it much easier to avoid any official Omi forces, I suspect, as those would likely have been coming down the main roads between Omi and Asuka. But there were still government outposts along the way. If these outposts proved loyal to the Omi court, they could raise the alarm and send a messenger on horseback who could likely flee much more quickly than Oama's men could follow. And if Omi learned that Oama was on the move, they could quickly mobilize their forces, secure key strategic points, and Oama's mad rush would be for naught. The path Oama chose would lead from Yoshino through the valleys, up through Iga, and then over to Suzuka in Ise, modern Mie Prefecture. The journey was long and it wasn't going to be easy, but they needed to move quickly. Speaking of which, since Oama was traveling on foot, one of his men, Agata no Inukai no Ootomo, gave Prince Oama his own horse to ride. By the way, let me stop here for a moment. There are going to be a lot of people named Ootomo in the narrative, not just Prince Oama's nephew and the rival for the throne. Sorry, it was apparently a somewhat popular name, and it was also a clan or uji name as well. So I'll try to distinguish some of them in the podcast blog page, but just bear with me. Now, the party hadn't traveled far when Oama's own carriage, or possibly a palanquin like his wife's, showed up for him, so I assume Otomo got his horse back, but they were still constrained to the speed of their slowest member, and I doubt that the mountain roads were all that wide and flat, most likely just the opposite. The group journeyed upstream along the Tsuburo River and eventually made it to Aki in the area of Uda, due east of Sakurai and Mount Miwa. Here they were overtaken by two men, known as Otomo no Muraji no Makuda and Kibumi no Muraji no Otomo. See what I mean about that name? Both hurrying on from the Yoshino palace. Now, Makuda had been at the Omi court, but word was starting to spread there was going to be some kind of move against Prince Oama, so he and his brother, Otomo no Fuke, had feigned illness and returned to their home in the Asuka region. Once there, Makuda had made straight away for Yoshino, only to find that Oama was already on the move. Otomo no Fuke, on the other hand, chose to stay in the area of Asuka and see what he could do there. He was looking to see what kind of forces he could raise in the ancient capital region, and trust me, we'll hear more about him later. It was also in Aki, apparently, where they met Hashino Muraji no Mate, who was from the department of the official rice fields. Now, even though he was a government official, he was apparently a supporter of Oama and his cause, and so he supplied Oama and his people with food for their journey. Just north of the Aki fields, they came upon Kamura, thought to be near modern Kaguraoka, where the Yoshino forces conscripted 20 hunters into service, almost doubling their numbers, and now at least they had some weapons with them. Prince Mino and presumably his men then also joined forces with Oama and his party, so their ranks were starting to grow. So in Uda, they were no doubt glad of any assistance, and at the government offices in the village of Uda itself, they were also warmly welcomed. There they found 50 pack horses that were laden down with rice meant for the hot baths of Ise. The rice was discarded, and Oama commandeered the pack animals so that his forces could ride rather than walk. Nonetheless, it was still a long way to go. Indeed, night was approaching by the time they reached Ono, likely the modern area of Muro-ono and Onoji along the Uda River. They didn't want to stop, though, but it could be treacherous trying to navigate the mountains in the dark, so what were they to do? What they needed was a light source. And so we're told that they pulled down some of the fences of nearby houses, which I'm sure the locals absolutely loved, and they created makeshift torches to light their way. Thus, they were able to continue on until they reached the town of Nabari at approximately midnight. Now, Nabari was not quite so friendly as Uda. It was the home of a post station which had a duty to report things to the Omi court. Oama and his men arrived with their torches, and in the middle of the night they attacked and set fire to the post station. One could only imagine how surprised those manning the station must have been. Presumably, Oama's party took any horses and provisions both for their own use and so that they couldn't be used against them. To those members of the village that were woken up and who came out to see what was going on, Oama's entourage proclaimed that Prince Oama was heading east and that people should join them. More specifically, we are told that he said that the Sumera no Mikoto, or Tenno, was on his way to the East Country. And I want to pause here a moment because there are some that say this was the first use of the term Sumera no Mikoto, or, as we more commonly read the characters today, Tenno. At the very least, we believe that the term Tenno may have first been used in this time period, though I do wonder about it being used in this particular instance. I'll come back to this at the end, but for now, let's just get on with the story. So Oama announced to the people that he, the sovereign, for he had declared himself as such, was heading to the eastern lands, and he invited anyone who wished to join him. Nobody took him up on his offer, however. I mean, it must have sounded crazy. Oama had swept in at midnight, his forces carrying torches, and had attacked the post station, the symbol of the government, in their midst. I mean, I imagine that the people wanted little or nothing to do with any further conflict if they could help it. Continuing on in the darkness, Oama and his party came to a river, probably the Nabari River. The Chronicle only refers to it as a Yokokawa, a term that shows up multiple times and seems to mean something like a side river or something. I suspect it was just the name for a river that either ran alongside the fields or just kind of flat or something similar. as they were crossing a dark cloud spread across the night sky for over 10 rods, about 100 feet. Oama kindled a light and took a look at a geomantic rule to determine what it could mean. Now, this rule was possibly a type of stick or even a kind of compass-like device with a square bottom and round top, often indicating the heavens and the earth. He announced to everyone there that the cloud was an omen that the country would be divided into two parts, but ultimately, of course, their side would win out. One can only imagine how tired and worn out everyone was at this point, but apparently this oracle urged them onward. They reached Iga, where once again they attacked and set fire to the post station. Now, getting through Iga must have had Oama's head on a swivel. After all, Prince Otomo's mother was apparently from that region. He was the Iga royal prince, after all, so it would be understandable if the people there were loyal to him. Fortunately for Oama, he had his local supporters as well. Now, Joan Pigott points out in The Emergence of Japanese Kingship that Oama may have had a surprising amount of support from the various local elites. Now, remember that the policies that Nakano Oe and the court had previously put into place had given a lot of power to court-appointed officials at the expense of the traditional local elites. So it may have been that those traditional local elites were a bit more inclined to assist Oama against the Omi court, or really anyone going up against the Omi court, while those appointed officials, such as those who were managing the post stations, were probably more likely to swing the other way, since their positions and their stipends were directly reliant on the court's good graces. Of course, it was an individual thing. This isn't something that you can say everyone in this position did one thing or another. There were lots of other factors and a lot of other loyalties going on at this time. So, court politics was still court politics. At least in this particular instance, around Nakayama and Iga, we're told that they met with local district governors who had heard that Oama was on the move and who had raised several hundred men in support of his cause. So now their ranks really had grown compared with the relatively small group that had first set out from Yoshino the previous day. There were now hundreds of men on the march. Oama's forces finally arrived at the plain of Tara or Tarano by dawn, and with the sun coming over the mountains, they briefly stopped for a moment to catch their breath and eat something. They had just marched through the night, a distance of approximately 70 kilometers or 43.5 miles. That included stops to attack and set fire to two post stations along the way, and much of the journey early on was done on foot. During the march, their ranks had grown tremendously, and this is an incredible feat, especially with much of it being accomplished at night. Let's also quickly discuss those extra troops that had come to his banner. Remember that prior to this, Prince Oama had sent messengers ahead to Mino and Owari to try and raise forces in those areas. They'd likely traveled these same roadways and probably told any allies they had to prepare. So while the forces were raised quickly, there were no doubt some logistics that went into it. Now, after a brief rest, the army was back on their feet, heading to Yamaguchi, modern Suge City. Here, Oama was greeted by his son, Prince Takechi, who had come down from Omi down through Kauka, modern Koka, aka Koga. He had brought several other men of his own, and presumably soldiers as well. Prince Takechi and his brother, Prince Otsu, had been told by some of the messengers sent out by Oama earlier about his move to the east, and they were told to come and meet him. So it seems Prince Takechi had made it there first. Now the entire party, Prince Takechi and his men included, crossed Mount Miyama and into Suzuka in Ise, where they were joined by the provincial governor, Miyake no Muraji no Iwatoko, the deputy governor, Miwa no Kimi no Kobuto, and the magistrate of the famous hot baths, Tanaka no Omi no Tarumaro, among others. That same morning, they set a troop of 500 soldiers to guard the pass. After all, it would do them no good to have a government force suddenly appear behind them. Also, you may recall that Oama's request to his allies in Mino was to take the Fuwa Pass in the north. the area more popularly known today as Sekigahara. So now, with both the Suzuka and Fuwa passes under Oama's control, his forces controlled access to the eastern countries. The only other viable route, at least if you didn't want to get lost in the mountains, was to take the road to the north through Koshi, and that was going to be a slog around or over the Japan Alps. So a garrison was left as a rearguard, but the troops who were not staying to guard the pass continued turning northwards. By sunset on the 25th day of the 6th month of 672, they had reached the foot of Kahawa Hill. Here, Oama's consort, Princess Uno no Sarara, asked if they could take a break. She was not exactly used to this kind of travel, but I doubt any of them really were, and even riding on the palanquin, she was exhausted and fatigued. As they looked to the sky, though, it was clear that dark clouds were gathering, so they cut their rest short and pushed on, hoping to make it to the government offices at Mie, likely meaning modern-day Yokkaichi City. Sure enough, as they continued to march, the heavens opened with a thunderstorm pouring down on them. The entire army was soaked to the bone. Cold and wet, when they did get to the government center of Mie District, they deliberately set fire to an entire building just so that the troops could try to warm themselves a bit. Those who had set out from Yoshino, well, by this point they had marched over 122 kilometers or 75 miles, including over 700 meters of elevation up and 800 meters down. Checking a map of the route, it suggests that a person walking it today without any breaks would take around 28 hours to complete the trip, and indeed, Oama's took roughly 1.5 days. That includes time for their assaults on the various post stations and a brief rest at the Tara fields. Now granted, they had procured horses for parts of that, and many of the soldiers had not necessarily been there since the beginning, but it's still an incredible feat when you think about it. I'm honestly surprised that it doesn't get more of a mention in various historical contexts. Then again, we're still well before the age of the samurai, which is the period probably most martial historians typically examine. So that night, as they were settling in the Mie Government Center following their amazing dash across the mountains, word came from forces at Suzuka. A Prince Yamabe and Prince Ishikawa had apparently come to offer their allegiance to Oama. However, as they weren't known to any of the men, they were held at the Suzuka barrier till someone could verify their identities. Oama sent Michi no Atai no Masubito to go fetch them and bring them to him. Following morning, Oama worshipped towards Amaterasu on the banks of a river in the district of Asake. Thinking about it, I'm not sure if they meant that he worshipped south in the direction of Ise Shrine, which is a shrine to Amaterasu, or if they meant he worshipped east, the direction of the rising sun. The exact direction doesn't entirely matter, but I think we will come back to this later, as it would have consequences later on. Now, Masubito eventually returned from his errand, catching back up to the army, which was continuing on its way by this point. Turns out that it was not actually Princes Yamabe and Ishikawa that Masubito had found at Suzuka, but instead Oama's own son, Prince Otsu, who had come along to join his father and his brother. I presume he had been traveling under a false name in case he ran into men loyal to the Omi court. He was followed by a number of others, including a list of names which I'm not going to go over here because it wouldn't mean all that much. Suffice it to say that the chroniclers were doing their best to make sure that various families were remembered for exactly what they did at this point. Now, just as Prince Otsu was joining the main force, Murakami no Oyori arrived with word that 3,000 Mino troops were mobilized and currently blocking the Fuwa Road. You may recall that Oyori was the one that Oama had sent to Mino for just that purpose, scouting out the lay of the land and raising some early troops. Oama sent Prince Takechi ahead to Fuwa to organize the forces there. Then he sent 2 others to mobilize troops along the Tokaido region, and 2 more were sent into the mountains to levy soldiers from the Tozando region. As a quick reminder, the Tokaido was the Eastern Sea Road, while the Tozando was the Eastern Mountain Road, and that one went through the middle of Eastern Honshu through the more mountainous regions. Together, these 2 routes would have pulled from the most populous regions of the east. As for Oama, he took up residence at the government center in Kuwana, where he spent some of the time resting up a bit. Now, just as Oama was building up his forces, so too was the Omi court. As soon as word made it to the capital that Oama was on the move, chaos ensued. Many people fled the capital, some heading to the east, perhaps to join Oama, while others went to hide in the mountains and marshes until all the chaos was over and the dust was settled. The young Prince Otomo asked the ministers what he should do, and they recommended that he immediately set out with cavalry to pursue Oama and catch him before he could assemble too many troops. However, Otomo decided not to heed their advice, instead opting to assemble an army of his own to add to the soldiers that had already been levied. Otomo sent messengers out to raise troops. He sent Ina no Iwasuki, Fumi no Kusuri, and Osaka no Omaro to the east country, while Hozumi no Momotari and his younger brother, Ioye and Mononobe no Hyuga, headed to the Yamato capital, which is to say Asuka, to raise forces there. Others were probably also sent, but we know of at least two more. Otomo also sent Saeki no Otoko to Tsukushi and Kusu no Iwate to Kibi, all with orders to levy troops there. He gave Otoko and Iwate, though, special instructions, since there was some concern that neither Tsukushi nor Kibi would be exactly compliant, as they both had been supporters of Oama and might still feel ties to him. So if the leaders of either of those areas were to resist, Otoko and Iwate were authorized to execute them for treason. As Iwasuki, Kusuri, and Omaro headed east, they traveled around the south of Lake Biwa and were headed to the Fuwa Pass, not knowing that it was already controlled by Oama's forces. Iwasuki, however, was somewhat cautious. He realized that they might be ambushed on the way by supporters of Oama, and so he held back from the main group. Sure enough, he was right. Kusuri and Omaro were ambushed and captured, at which point Iwasuki fled, barely escaping himself. The following day, Prince Takechi sent a note to his father, asking him to move closer to Fuwa so that they could better communicate with the front lines. Oama headed out, but left Princess Uno in Kuwana, which was well situated between Fuwa and Suzuka and was likely far enough from the front lines to ensure that it wouldn't be disrupted by skirmishes at the passes. As Oama then traveled through Owari, the governor, Chi Sakobi no Muraji no Sabichi, also joined him with a force of 20,000 men. Oama had them divided up and set them on roads to various places as needed. Oama finally reached Nogami, just on the eastern edge of modern Sekigahara. This is near where Tokugawa Ieyasu would eventually make his first camp as well, at his fateful battle here just under 1,000 years later. At Nogami, Oama would set up his headquarters, Nogami no Miya, or the Nogami Palace. Meanwhile, Prince Takechi would handle the troops in the main part of the area near the pass, known as Wazami. As Oama reached Nogami, Takechi came to conference with him. He noted that there had already been an altercation. They had taken prisoners even, who claimed they were actually headed to the east to raise troops for Oama, but given that they didn't know who they were and that Iwasuki had fled back towards Otsukyo, well, suggested that this was not exactly the case. Following that incident and a fair amount of speechifying, Oama eventually placed Prince Takechi formally in charge of the army, presenting him the gift of a saddle horse, and Takechi went back to his camp at Wazami. That night, a severe thunderstorm broke out. Oama prayed that if the kami favored his case, they would make the storm abate, and wouldn't you know it, immediately the thunder and lightning stopped. Of course, if it hadn't, just probably wouldn't get written down here. Just saying. The next day, on the 28th of the 6th month, Oama traveled over to Wazami to review the troops and check on the military arrangements, before then returning back to Nogami. He likewise went out the following day, issuing commands through Prince Takechi, and then returned again to Nogami. At this point, soldiers were likely on their way from the eastern provinces and elsewhere. On the one hand, they wanted to wait and make sure that they had all the troops they needed, but on the other hand, they didn't want to wait too long. The Omi court was also building up its forces, and the longer they waited, the greater the chance that they could dig in and entrench themselves. something would have to happen soon. That's something? We'll have to wait for next episode. Before we finish, though, I do want to come back to something, that title, Tenno or Sumere no Mikoto. Up to this point, evidence suggests that the term used for the sovereign of Yamato was not Tenno as we know it today, but instead was the term Okimi. Now, Okimi, or basically the big Kimi or the big lord, was the one lord of lords of Yamato, but that was probably something based on local concepts of governance. With the introduction of new ideas from the continent, many of those based on Han and Tang Dynasty government models, we see a shift in the terminology as well. There are poems that come from the era of Nakano Oe, Tenji Tenno, that use terms like Huang and Di, Ko and Te, and Japanese onyomi readings. These are imperial terms from the continent. At some point, however, we see that they use Tian and Huang. So instead of Huang Di, we get Tian Huang, which becomes Tenno when read in Japanese onyomi, and it critically utilizes the character Tian for heaven. Interestingly, this does not appear to be a term that was ever commonly used for rulers in the area of modern China. I seem to recall that it was used here and there, but not with any frequency. There is some thought that it may have been pulled from a term for the North Star or Pole Star, which sometimes used the term, I suspect referring to that star as the heavenly ruler, the star that the heavens themselves were focused on, given that they all seemed to turn around it. For a variety of reasons, we see a particular emphasis on heaven and on Amaterasu in the decades following 672, and it's thought that this might all be connected. And so it's generally from sometime here in the late 7th century that we can probably start to refer to the sovereigns as Tenno. Although it is unclear to me exactly how the authors of the Nihon Shoki pronounce this word. Later glosses give the characters a Japanese reading of Sumere no Mikoto, which may have some localized meaning, but was this what it was first called, or were they using Tenno, the Chinese reading? Problem is also that the Nihon Shoki projects this term back to the very beginning of the narrative, with Jinmu Tenno being the first. However, we have some evidence that the earlier term was, as I said before, Okimi. For many years, there was an idea that the term Sumere no Mikoto first appeared in the era of Toyomike Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno, probably because that is when Buddhism and the continental studies really seemed to kick off. However, there really is no evidence for its use at that point, and it seems that more scholars today place its first use in the late 7th or early 8th century. So there is the possibility that this title was first used by Oama, as some claim, when he declared that the Sumere no Mikoto, or Tenno, was headed to the eastern countries. Of course, that could all just be dramatic license by the chroniclers, who were probably less concerned with what exactly he said and more concerned with the meaning of it all. After all, if by the end of the term he was being called Sumere no Mikoto, then they could have projected that back to the beginning of his reign. After all, they projected it all the way back to Jinmu Tenno, so what's, decade or so. Now, we've also known them to swap out older terms for those used in the 8th century, updating the narrative. For instance, they'll go ahead and call Wa, Yamato, or Nihon, and various other things. So it's clear that at times they were kind of updating the language as they went. Regardless, I do think that about this time, we can start referring to the sovereigns of Yamato and eventually Japan, or Nihon, another term that we'll get into at some point, as Tenno or Sumere no Mikoto from about this period. I'll probably still use the term sovereign in general, and I'll try to avoid the term imperial for anything prior to the 19th century, when it does become a standard English translation. I mean, after all, empires were all the rage in the 19th century. I mean, you had the Chinese, the Ottoman, the British, Austrian, French, Spanish, you name it. Everyone had an empire, and so Japan, following that model, must also have been an empire, right? I Even today, it is officially the imperial household, and that is the official translation. However, I want to be cautious about using that translation too early. The institution of Tenno, while modeled on the Tang Dynasty, really took on its own character, and as such, I think that it is best to avoid the term for now because it really was its own thing. And I don't want to conflate too many foreign concepts of emperor with the idea of the Japanese ruler. As for the term Sumera no Mikoto, doesn't appear to me that the etymology of this term is clearly known. One explanation that I saw is that Sumera is related to the word suberu, to rule. Sumera is also defined as meaning something precious, although I'm not sure if that meaning existed before its use to refer to the sovereign. And Mikoto is simply an honorific referring to the sovereign, probably meaning royal or imperial. Sorry, using that term again. And we find it in a lot of royal names as well as names of various kami in one form or another, though with different characters. I suspect that the term Tenno came over first and probably later became glossed as Sumera no Mikoto, although that may have been an earlier term that was in use. We just don't have any clear evidence. Variations do appear in the Manyoshu, the collection of ancient poems, so the concept was clearly around by the 7th and 8th century. Anyway, that's probably enough. We'll probably talk about it more when we get to the rise of the worship of Amaterasu, but until then, let's continue with our series on the Jinshin War. So next episode, we will kick off with some of the actual fighting and campaigns in Omi, Iga, and in Yamato. Until then, thank you once again for listening and for all of your support. Remember, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our Ko-Fi site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, probably a bit of a who's who with some names spelled out for you. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.